Diana, honey, your uncle has been stealing from us for 15 years, and I have proof. Those were the first words I read when I opened the manila envelope hidden behind my grandmother's jewelry box, written in her careful handwriting and dated just 2 weeks before she died. The letter continued in shaking script that made my heart pound with disbelief and rage. Robert thinks I don't understand the papers he makes me sign, but I've been keeping my own records. He's taken nearly $300,000 that belong to you children. I'm too scared to confront him while I'm alive, but I trust you to stop him after I'm gone. I'm Diana. I'm 42 years old, and I was cleaning out Grandma Rose's bedroom 6 months after her funeral when I discovered that everything I believed about my family was a carefully constructed lie. The humid Tuesday afternoon air felt suffocating as I read page after page of evidence that my uncle, the man our family revered as our financial guardian, was actually a thief who'd been robbing us for over a decade. The envelope was marked, "For Diana only. Open if something happens to me," in Grandma's handwriting. And inside were 23 pages of bank statements, property deeds, and handwritten notes that revealed the most devastating betrayal imaginable. Sometimes the most devastating family secrets are hidden in plain sight, waiting in manila envelopes for the right person to discover that everything you believed about your loved ones was carefully constructed lies. My Uncle Robert, Dad's older brother who'd always positioned himself as the family patriarch, the responsible one who handled all the business stuff, had been systematically stealing from our family for over 15 years. The evidence was meticulously documented in my grandmother's shaking handwriting: forged signatures, redirected inheritance funds, property transfers that had never been authorized, and manipulated bank accounts that should have been distributed equally among the grandchildren. If you're watching this video because you've discovered that someone you trusted has been betraying your family for years, you understand the physical nausea that washed over me as I read page after page of Robert's systematic theft. The man who'd given speeches at every family gathering about keeping the family together and honoring Grandpa's legacy had been destroying that legacy for his own financial gain. The documents showed that my grandfather's estate, which should have been worth nearly $400,000 when distributed among his 4 grandchildren, had been reduced to less than $50,000 through Robert's management. Properties that belonged to the family had been quietly transferred to Robert's name. Inheritance funds that were supposed to be held in trust had been moved to accounts only Robert could access. But the most heartbreaking discovery was a letter my grandmother had written but never sent, addressed to the entire family, explaining how she'd discovered Robert's theft but was too afraid of destroying the family to confront him directly. "I've been watching Robert take what belongs to all of you for years," she'd written in her careful script. "I kept hoping he would do the right thing, but instead he's gotten bolder. He thinks I don't understand the paperwork he puts in front of me, but I've been keeping my own records. Diana, if something happens to me and you're reading this, please don't let him get away with stealing your inheritance. You're the only one strong enough to stand up to him." The most devastating realizations often come with the understanding that someone who loved you saw the truth but felt powerless to protect you from it while they were alive. The afternoon sunlight streaming through Grandma's bedroom windows felt suddenly cold against my skin as I processed the implications of what I was holding. For 15 years, Robert had been presenting himself as the family's financial guardian while systematically robbing us. Every family meeting where he'd explained why there wasn't as much inheritance as expected. Every time he'd made us feel guilty for questioning his decisions. Every occasion when he'd positioned himself as generous for taking care of all the complicated legal stuff. It had all been manipulation designed to cover his theft. The sound of my phone buzzing interrupted my shock. A text from my cousin Sarah, Robert's daughter. "Dad says we need to finalize Grandma's estate paperwork this weekend. He's prepared everything for us to sign." The timing felt like a slap in the face. While I was discovering evidence of her father's systematic theft, Sarah was helping him prepare for what I now understood would be the final phase of his plan, getting us to sign documents that would legitimize his appropriation of everything that remained. I walked through Grandma's house like someone visiting a crime scene, understanding for the first time that this beautiful family home, the center of our holiday gatherings, the place where 4 generations had celebrated life's milestones, would soon be sold, with the proceeds disappearing into Robert's carefully constructed financial maze. The kitchen where Grandma had cooked Christmas dinners for 40 years, the living room where we'd opened presents and shared family stories, the garden where she'd taught me to plant flowers. All of it was about to be sacrificed to feed Robert's greed. As I sat in her rocking chair that evening, surrounded by the evidence of his betrayal, I made a decision that would change our family forever. I wasn't going to let Robert complete his theft. I wasn't going to sign his papers or allow him to manipulate us into accepting his version of what Grandma had intended. Sometimes the most important decisions we make are born from discovering that staying silent would make us complicit in the destruction of everything someone we loved had worked to preserve. The woman who'd always been the peacekeeper, who'd spent her whole life avoiding family conflict and trusting Robert's judgment about business matters, was about to become the person who exposed his lies and fought for what was rightfully ours. What I didn't know yet was that confronting Robert would reveal not just financial theft, but a network of family manipulation so sophisticated that it had convinced everyone who mattered that I was the problem, not him. Before I tell you how my grandmother's documents shattered everything I believed about my family, let me paint you a picture of the 15 years that led to that devastating Tuesday afternoon. The story begins with the scent of grief and the sound of Robert's authoritative voice explaining why we needed to let him handle everything after my grandfather passed away. I was 27 when Grandpa died, young enough to be grateful that someone older and more experienced was willing to navigate the complicated world of estates and inheritances. Robert was Dad's older brother by 8 years, a successful insurance agent who'd always been the family's go-to person for financial advice and important decisions. "You kids don't need to worry about any of this legal stuff," Robert had said at the first family meeting after Grandpa's funeral, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd convinced himself his lies were acts of generosity. "I'll take care of all the paperwork and make sure everyone gets what's fair." Grandpa would have wanted the family to stick together during this difficult time. Sometimes the most dangerous people in our lives are those who position their exploitation as protection, making us grateful for the very manipulation that's destroying our futures. The funeral home still smelled like flowers and sadness when Robert presented us with documents he claimed were Grandpa's final wishes. Dad was too heartbroken to question anything. My aunts were overwhelmed with grief, and I was just relieved that someone was handling the overwhelming complexity of legal paperwork that I didn't understand. Robert had been preparing for this moment for years, I now realize. He'd been the one who drove Grandpa to update his will during the last months of his life, when early dementia was making him confused and susceptible to suggestion. He'd been the one who helped Grandpa organize his financial records, giving Robert access to every account and property deed. If you've ever been grateful to have a family member who seemed willing to handle complicated responsibilities during times of grief, you understand how easy it is to mistake manipulation for generosity. Robert's willingness to take care of everything felt like a blessing when we were too emotional to think clearly about the implications of giving one person complete control over our family's financial future. The first red flag should have been his insistence that all communications about the estate go through him. "I don't want you kids getting confused by all the legal terminology," he'd explain when anyone asked about specific details. "Let me handle the lawyers and accountants. I'll keep everything simple for everyone else." But grief makes people trusting, and Robert had spent decades building credibility as the family's financial expert. He was the one who'd helped people with insurance claims, the one who'd explain tax implications when family members bought houses, the one who'd been trusted with power of attorney for elderly relatives. The most sophisticated thieves are those who spend years building trust before stealing, creating such a solid reputation for helpfulness that their victims defend them even while being robbed. The updates Robert provided during family gatherings always sounded reasonable and well-intentioned. The estate was more complicated than expected because Grandpa had some debts that needed to be settled first. The inheritance distribution was taking longer than anticipated because property values had fluctuated, and he wanted to maximize everyone's portion. "Robert's doing such a great job keeping track of everything," my Aunt Linda would say during Sunday dinners. "I don't know what we'd do without him handling all these details." And we believed it, because Robert had created a narrative where he was the family member making sacrifices to protect everyone else. He talked about the stress of dealing with lawyers and accountants, the burden of making difficult decisions about family assets, the responsibility he felt to honor Grandpa's wishes while protecting everyone's interests. The years passed with Robert providing periodic updates about progress on finalizing the estate. There were always reasonable explanations for delays: market conditions that made property sales inadvisable, legal complications that required additional paperwork, tax considerations that needed careful planning. "I know you're all eager to receive your inheritance," Robert would say during these updates, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone dealing with unreasonable expectations. But rushing these decisions could cost the family thousands of dollars. Grandpa trusted me to do this right, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. Meanwhile, Robert's own financial situation seemed to improve dramatically. He bought a new house, took expensive vacations, and made investments that seemed inconsistent with his income as an insurance agent. But when anyone mentioned his apparent prosperity, he had ready explanations: a successful year in sales, smart investment decisions, careful saving over time. Sometimes the most obvious signs of theft are hidden in plain sight, disguised as success stories that make the thief seem financially savvy rather than criminally dishonest. The few times family members asked specific questions about the estate timeline or distribution amounts, Robert would become defensive and hurt. "After everything I've done to protect this family's interests, I can't believe you're questioning my integrity," he'd say, his voice carrying the wounded tone of someone whose generosity was being unfairly attacked. These emotional manipulations were incredibly effective because they positioned anyone who asked questions as ungrateful and suspicious. Robert had created a family dynamic where questioning his management was equivalent to attacking his character, making it socially impossible to demand accountability without appearing selfish and accusatory. Dad, who'd always looked up to his older brother, became Robert's most reliable defender. "Robert's been handling financial matters for this family for decades," Dad would say, whenever I expressed concerns about the lack of transparency. "If you can't trust your own uncle, who can you trust?" The irony of that question became devastating once I discovered Grandma's documents. The person we'd been taught to trust completely had been systematically betraying that trust for over a decade, using our love and respect for family loyalty as weapons against our own financial security. The cruelest aspect of family financial abuse is how it weaponizes the very values that make families strong: trust, loyalty, and respect for elders, against the family members who embody those values most completely. By the time Grandma became too frail to live independently and moved into Robert's house for easier care, he had complete control over family finances and had successfully trained everyone to see his management as generous leadership rather than systematic theft. What I didn't understand until I read her secret documents was that Grandma had been watching, documenting, and desperately trying to find a way to expose Robert's theft without destroying the family relationship she'd spent her whole life nurturing. The woman who'd always been the peacekeeper had spent her final years as a secret detective, gathering evidence of her stepson's betrayal while feeling powerless to stop it. Her hidden documents weren't just proof of Robert's crimes, they were a legacy of love, a final gift to ensure that his theft couldn't continue after she was gone. Armed with my grandmother's devastating evidence, I called my own family meeting 3 days before Robert's planned document signing session. The scent of morning coffee filled my kitchen as I organized 23 pages of proof into folders that would destroy the lie our family had been living for 15 years. My hands were steady as I made copies of bank statements, property transfers, and Grandma's handwritten notes. But my heart was racing with the knowledge that I was about to detonate a bomb in the middle of our family's carefully constructed peace. "I need everyone to come over Sunday afternoon," I'd told Dad, my voice carrying a firmness that surprised us both. "There are some things about Grandma's estate that we need to discuss before anyone signs Robert's papers." "Diana, honey, Robert's been handling these matters perfectly well for years," Dad replied, his tone carrying the familiar defensiveness that had always ended previous discussions about estate transparency. "I trust him completely." "That's exactly the problem, Dad. We've all been trusting him completely while he's been lying to us completely." Sometimes the most important conversations begin with statements so shocking that they force people to choose between continuing their comfortable ignorance and confronting devastating truths. If you've ever prepared to expose a family member's systematic deception, you understand the weight of knowing that your next words will change everything: relationships, family dynamics, and people's understanding of their own history. The living room where I'd hosted countless birthday parties and holiday celebrations was about to become a courtroom where I'd present evidence that would shatter my family's trust in someone they'd revered for decades. Dad arrived first, followed by my aunts Linda and Margaret, and finally my cousins Sarah and Michael, Robert's children, who had no idea they were about to learn their father was a thief. Robert himself was notably absent, claiming he had previous commitments, but would review whatever Diana wanted to discuss at the official meeting. "I know this is going to be hard to hear," I began, placing the folders on the coffee table like evidence in a trial. "But I found documents in Grandma's room that prove Robert has been stealing from our family's inheritance for over 15 years. The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief and dawning horror. Sarah's face went pale, Dad looked confused and angry, and my aunts exchanged glances that suggested they thought I'd lost my mind. "Diana, that's a very serious accusation," Aunt Linda said, her voice carrying the diplomatic tone of someone trying to defuse a family crisis. "Robert has been nothing but generous with his time and expertise." "Then explain this," I replied, opening the first folder to reveal photocopied bank statements showing systematic transfers from estate accounts to Robert's personal accounts. "These are Grandma's records. She'd been documenting his theft for years." The most powerful moments in family confrontations come when documentation replaces speculation, forcing everyone to confront objective evidence rather than emotional loyalties. For the next 2 hours, I walked them through Grandma's evidence: property deeds that had been forged, inheritance funds that had been redirected, investment accounts that should have grown but had instead been depleted through Robert's management fees, and unauthorized withdrawals. The property transfers were particularly damaging. Grandpa's house, which should have been held in trust for equal distribution among the grandchildren, had been quietly transferred to Robert's name through documents signed during Grandpa's confused final months. 2 rental properties that had generated income for decades had been sold, with the proceeds disappearing into accounts only Robert controlled. "Look at the dates," I said, pointing to transaction records that showed the pattern of theft. Every time there was a family gathering where someone asked about inheritance timing, Robert would transfer more money out of estate accounts within the following week. He was using our questions as signals that he needed to accelerate his theft. Sarah was crying by this point, her hands shaking as she studied documents that proved her father was not the honorable family patriarch she'd believed him to be, but a criminal who'd been stealing from his own relatives for over a decade. "This can't be right," she whispered. "Dad wouldn't do this to family." "Your dad has been doing this to family for 15 years, I replied, my voice steady despite the heartbreak of watching my cousin's world collapse. "The only reason we know about it now is because Grandma was secretly documenting everything." The most damaging evidence was a letter Grandma had written but never sent, detailing her attempts to confront Robert privately about discrepancies she'd noticed in financial statements. Robert had convinced her that she was confused about complicated financial matters and that her concerns were symptoms of age-related memory problems. Sometimes the most heartbreaking aspect of family financial abuse is discovering how the thief convinced their victims that questioning obvious theft was evidence of mental decline rather than legitimate concern. Dad was the hardest to convince because his loyalty to Robert was so deeply ingrained. "There has to be some explanation," he kept saying, even while staring at bank records that showed his brother systematically looting their father's estate. "Robert's been family for 60 years. He wouldn't steal from us." "Dad, Robert has been stealing from us for 15 years. The explanation is that he's been lying to your face while robbing your children's inheritance." Aunt Margaret, who'd always been the most financially savvy family member, was studying the investment account statements with growing alarm. "Diana, if these records are accurate, the estate should be worth nearly 4 times what Robert told us it was worth." "That's exactly right. Grandma calculated that Robert has stolen over $300,000 from our family. Money that should have been distributed equally among the 4 grandchildren has been funding his lifestyle improvements for over a decade." The evidence was so comprehensive and damaging that even Robert's children couldn't deny what their father had been doing. Michael, who'd always defended his father's financial expertise, was staring at documents that showed systematic theft disguised as estate management. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "Do we call the police? Do we confront Dad? Do we try to get the money back?" "First, nobody signs Robert's papers on Wednesday," I said firmly. "Whatever he's prepared for us to sign is designed to legitimize his theft and make it impossible to recover what he's stolen." "But he'll know something's wrong if we suddenly refuse to sign," Dad worried. "He's been planning this meeting for weeks." "Let him know something's wrong. I'm done pretending everything's fine while he steals our inheritance." Sometimes the most courageous act is refusing to continue enabling someone's deception, even when that refusal will expose family secrets that everyone has been too afraid to acknowledge. The meeting ended with an agreement that no one would sign Robert's documents and that I would be the one to confront him with Grandma's evidence. The family members who'd spent years defending Robert's management were finally ready to demand accountability, but they wanted me to be the spokesperson because I was the one who discovered the truth. As everyone left my house that evening, the weight of what was coming felt enormous. I was about to confront a man who'd spent 15 years perfecting his ability to manipulate our family, armed with evidence that would destroy his reputation and potentially send him to prison. But I was also fighting for my grandmother's legacy, for the inheritance she'd worked her whole life to preserve for her grandchildren, and for the truth she'd been too afraid to speak while she was alive. The woman who'd always avoided family conflict was about to start the biggest fight our family had ever experienced, because some things are more important than keeping the peace. I called Robert Tuesday morning, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system as I prepared to confront a man who'd been deceiving my family for over a decade. The morning sunlight streaming through my kitchen windows felt like spotlights illuminating the evidence spread across my table, 23 pages of proof that would destroy his carefully constructed lies. "We need to talk before tomorrow's meeting," I told him, my words carrying a weight he couldn't yet understand. "I found some documents in Grandma's room that change everything about the estate settlement." There was a pause that felt loaded with calculation before Robert responded, his voice taking on the patronizing tone I'd heard him use whenever anyone questioned his financial management. "Diana, I understand you're emotional about losing Grandma, but I've been handling these matters for 15 years. There's nothing that needs to change about our plans. Robert, I found bank statements, property transfer records, Grandma's handwritten notes about money you've been moving without authorization. We're not signing anything until you explain where our inheritance went. Sometimes the most powerful moments in confronting family betrayal come when you hear the exact moment someone realizes their deception has been discovered, captured in the quality of silence that follows your accusation. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Robert's voice returned, but it was different now, controlled and careful in a way that confirmed he understood exactly what documents I'd found. I think you're misunderstanding some complicated financial transactions, he said finally. Why don't you bring whatever you found to tomorrow's meeting and I'll explain everything in context? No, Robert. I want you to come to my house tonight, alone, and explain to me how you justify stealing over $300,000 from your own family's inheritance. The word stealing hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be taken back. For 15 years, our family had danced around direct questions about Robert's management, using euphemisms and polite concerns instead of demanding concrete accountability. I was done with diplomatic language. That's a very serious accusation, Diana. I've devoted years of my life to protecting this family's financial interests. I don't appreciate having my integrity questioned based on documents you probably don't understand. Then come explain them to me. 7 o'clock tonight. Bring whatever records you have that justify transferring Grandpa's house to your name without family approval. If you've ever confronted someone about systematic deception, you know the strange power that comes from finally speaking truth directly instead of accepting their version of reality. For years, Robert had controlled our family's narrative about inheritance management. Now I was demanding he defend his actions using actual evidence instead of manipulative explanations. Robert arrived at my house that evening carrying a briefcase and wearing the expression of someone prepared for battle. The scent of his cologne mixed with my brewing coffee as he settled into my living room, his eyes immediately focusing on the manila folders spread across my coffee table. I assume those are the documents that have you so confused, he began, his voice carrying the condescending patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. Estate management is very complex, Diana. It's easy to misinterpret financial transactions when you don't understand the legal requirements. Then help me understand this, I replied, opening the first folder to reveal bank statements showing systematic transfers from estate accounts to his personal accounts. Explain to me how transferring $50,000 from Grandpa's investment account to your personal checking account constitutes estate management. Robert studied the documents with the expression of someone seeing familiar evidence from an unfamiliar perspective. Those were authorized management fees for handling complex legal and financial matters over several years. Estate administration requires significant time and expertise. Management fees that were never disclosed to the family and that amounted to nearly half the estate's value? What kind of management justifies fees of $150,000 for handling a $400,000 estate? The most revealing moments in confronting financial abuse come when the abuser realizes their victim has documentation that makes their usual explanations impossible to maintain. You're cherry-picking specific transactions without understanding the broader context, Robert replied, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. There were debts to be settled, taxes to be paid, legal fees for complex property transfers. Show me the documentation for these debts and legal fees. Show me the tax records that justify depleting investment accounts. Show me anything that proves these transfers were legitimate estate expenses rather than theft. Robert opened his briefcase and spread out documents he'd prepared to support his version of events. But as we compared his paperwork with Grandma's records, the contradictions became impossible to ignore. Property transfer dates didn't match his explanations, bank account balances contradicted his claims about estate values, and management fee justifications couldn't account for the systematic depletion Grandma had documented. The most damaging moment came when I showed him Grandma's letter. the one she'd written but never sent, detailing her growing awareness of his deception and her heartbreak about feeling powerless to stop it. She knew, Robert. For years, she knew you were stealing from us. She documented everything because she hoped someone would eventually have the courage to stop you. Robert's face went pale as he read his stepmother's careful handwriting, her detailed observations about discrepancies in statements he'd presented as gospel truth for over a decade. Rose was confused during her final years, he said quietly. Her memory wasn't reliable. She often misunderstood financial information. Her memory was fine, and these records prove it. Every transaction she questioned, every discrepancy she noted, every concern she raised about your management, it was all accurate. You convinced her she was confused to hide the fact that she was catching you in lies. Sometimes the most heartbreaking revelation in family financial abuse is understanding how the thief convinced their victims that recognizing obvious theft was evidence of mental decline rather than accurate perception. The confrontation continued for over 2 hours, with Robert alternating between defensive justifications and manipulative appeals to family loyalty. He claimed his actions had been motivated by desire to protect the family from complicated legal issues, that his management had prevented tax problems that would have cost everyone money, and that his fee structure had been standard practice for professional estate management. But every explanation fell apart when compared with Grandma's documented evidence. Bank records showed transfers that corresponded with no legitimate estate expenses. Property sales had generated income that disappeared into accounts only Robert controlled. Investment accounts that should have grown over 15 years had been systematically depleted through unauthorized withdrawals. Even if there were some irregularities in how I handled certain transactions, Robert said finally, pursuing this will destroy our family. Is your need to be right worth tearing apart relationships that have been strong for decades? Robert, you destroyed our family relationships the moment you decided to steal from us. I'm not tearing anything apart. I'm exposing what you've been hiding. Think about what this will do to your father. Think about Sarah and Michael. Think about family gatherings and holidays. Are you really willing to sacrifice all of that for money? It was the final manipulation, positioning my demand for justice as selfish destruction of family harmony, making me responsible for consequences that should fall on him for his systematic theft. I'm thinking about what Grandma wanted, which was for her grandchildren to receive the inheritance she and Grandpa worked their whole lives to provide. I'm thinking about justice for 15 years of lies, and I'm thinking about making sure you never have the opportunity to steal from anyone else. The meeting ended with Robert's promise to review the documentation more carefully and work out a fair resolution for everyone involved. But his tone suggested someone buying time to develop damage control strategies rather than someone prepared to accept accountability for his actions. As he gathered his papers and prepared to leave, I made my position clear. The family meeting is canceled. Nobody's signing any documents. And if you want to avoid criminal prosecution, you need to figure out how you're going to return the money you've stolen. Sometimes the most important declarations we make are those that finally establish consequences for behavior that's been allowed to continue without accountability for far too long. After Robert left, I sat in my living room surrounded by evidence of his betrayal, understanding that the hardest part was still coming. Exposing his theft was only the beginning of a fight that would test every family relationship and force everyone to choose between comfortable lies and difficult truths. But my grandmother's legacy deserved that fight, and our family's future depended on ensuring that her voice would finally be heard. The aftermath of my confrontation with Robert began within hours, as he launched a systematic campaign to control the family narrative and position me as an unstable troublemaker rather than the person who'd exposed his 15-year theft. My phone started ringing before I'd even finished my morning coffee, with family members who'd received Robert's version of our meeting. "Diana, Robert says you're making wild accusations based on documents you don't understand. Dad called to tell me, his voice heavy with the disappointment of someone whose loyalties were being torn apart. He's very hurt that you'd question his integrity after everything he's done for our family. The taste of frustration was bitter in my mouth as I realized Robert was already implementing damage control strategies he'd probably planned years earlier, knowing this day might eventually come. Dad, did Robert explain why there are bank records showing him transferring estate money to his personal accounts? Did he show you documentation justifying $300,000 in unauthorized management fees? He said there are complex legal and tax issues you're not considering. He's been protecting us from problems we don't understand. Sometimes the most frustrating aspect of exposing family financial abuse is discovering that the abuser's ability to manipulate sympathies is stronger than documented evidence of their crimes. If you've ever tried to convince family members that someone they trust has been betraying them systematically, you understand the exhaustion of fighting both the abuser's lies and their victim's desperate desire to continue believing comfortable fictions. By afternoon, the phone calls had escalated to angry confrontations. Sarah called, crying and furious, to tell me that I was destroying her father's reputation based on misunderstanding paperwork, and that my jealousy about Dad's financial success was making me see conspiracy where none existed. Sarah, your father transferred your grandfather's house to his own name without family approval. That's not a misunderstanding, that's theft. Dad has been managing family finances for decades. Maybe Grandma signed something she forgot about, or maybe she was confused about legal paperwork. You're ruining our family over money. The accusation stung because it revealed how effectively Robert had trained everyone to see financial accountability as greed rather than justice. Demanding proof of his management wasn't jealousy. It was basic responsibility for protecting family assets. The most sophisticated family manipulators train their victims to defend the manipulation, making anyone who demands accountability appear to be the real problem. Michael called that evening, his voice carrying the careful control of someone delivering an ultimatum. Diana, the families decided to proceed with Dad's estate settlement as planned. We think you're letting grief over Grandma cloud your judgment about financial matters that are over your head. Michael, I have bank statements. I have property transfer records. I have Grandma's handwritten documentation of your father's theft. What part of that evidence is over my head? Dad's going to have his attorney review everything and provide explanations for any transactions you're questioning. But we're not going to let you destroy our family based on suspicions. The family had already chosen sides, and I was losing. Robert's 15 years of positioning himself as the generous, responsible family patriarch had created loyalties so strong that documented evidence of his theft wasn't enough to overcome them. The most heartbreaking call came from Aunt Linda, who'd always been my closest family confidant. Honey, I understand you're upset about financial matters, but Robert's been nothing but generous with his time and expertise. Maybe you should consider whether pursuing this is really in the family's best interests. Linda, Robert has stolen over $300,000 from our inheritance. How is letting him get away with that in anyone's best interests except his? Even if there were some irregularities in how he handled things, is it worth tearing the family apart? We've been together for so many years. Some things are more important than money. The phrase, more important than money, became the family's rallying cry for enabling Robert's theft. Anyone who demanded accountability was positioned as prioritizing greed over relationships, making me the villain for refusing to let systematic theft continue unchallenged. Sometimes the most insidious family manipulation involves convincing everyone that demanding justice is less virtuous than enabling injustice for the sake of artificial peace. The social pressure became overwhelming. Family group chats excluded me, holiday planning proceeded without my input, and casual family communication stopped, including me in ways that felt like systematic emotional punishment for refusing to accept Robert's management. But the evidence didn't change based on family politics. Bank records still showed unauthorized transfers, property documents still revealed forged signatures, and Grandma's careful documentation still proved systematic theft, regardless of how many people preferred Robert's explanations. 3 weeks after my confrontation with Robert, Dad came to my house with an ultimatum disguised as a peace offering. The scent of autumn leaves filled my entryway as he stood on my doorstep, looking older and more fragile than I'd ever seen him. Diana, the family's decided to move forward with finalizing Grandma's estate. Robert's prepared new documents that address your concerns. We'd like you to be part of this process, but we can't let your suspicions delay everything indefinitely. Dad, they're not suspicions. They're documented facts. Robert has been stealing from us for 15 years. Honey, even if there were some problems with how Robert handled things, pursuing this legally would cost tens of thousands in attorney fees and destroy our family permanently. Sometimes forgiveness is more valuable than being right. The cruelest family betrayals often culminate with victims being asked to forgive systematic abuse for the sake of preserving relationships with people who enabled that abuse. The new documents Robert had prepared were masterpieces of manipulation, legal language that would retroactively authorize his previous unauthorized transactions, while distributing remaining estate assets in ways that appeared equitable, but actually legitimized his theft. If I sign these papers, Robert keeps everything he's stolen and gets legal protection against future accountability. If I don't sign, I lose my family, but preserve evidence that might help recover what he's taken. Diana, please don't make this choice about choosing sides. We're family. Family forgives and moves forward together. But forgiveness without acknowledgement isn't healing, it's enabling. And moving forward together while pretending systematic theft didn't happen wasn't family unity. It was organized denial designed to protect Robert from consequences. That night, sitting in my kitchen surrounded by copies of evidence that proved 15 years of family financial abuse, I made the decision that would change everything about my relationship with the people I'd loved my entire life. I wasn't going to sign Robert's papers. I wasn't going to let him legitimize his theft. And I wasn't going to pretend that preserving artificial family harmony was more important than honoring my grandmother's trust and protecting future generations from his manipulation. Sometimes the most difficult courage is the kind that requires choosing justice over acceptance, especially when that choice means standing alone against everyone you love. The woman who'd spent 42 years avoiding family conflict was about to become the person who refused to let systematic betrayal be forgiven without acknowledgement, even if that refusal cost her every relationship she'd spent her life nurturing. 6 months after discovering my grandmother's evidence, I sat in a lawyer's office across from an attorney who specialized in family financial abuse cases, surrounded by the same manila folders that had once felt like weapons and now felt like the only allies I had left. The scent of leather and coffee filled the law office as I prepared to take legal action against a man who'd stolen from my family while enjoying their protection and support. Ms. Diana, I have to be honest with you, Attorney Patricia Wells said, her voice carrying the professional sympathy of someone who'd seen too many families destroy themselves protecting financial predators. Cases like this are difficult to prosecute when the victims refuse to cooperate with the investigation. My family's refusal to acknowledge Robert's theft had created a legal nightmare. Without their testimony and cooperation, proving systematic financial abuse became nearly impossible, even with comprehensive documentation of unauthorized transactions. They're not protecting Robert because they don't believe he stole from us, I explained, my voice steadier than I felt. They're protecting him because they can't bear to accept that they've been enabling his theft for 15 years. Sometimes the most impossible legal battles are those fought against criminals whose victims have become so invested in defending their abuser that justice becomes secondary to preserving the illusion of family harmony. If you've ever pursued justice for family financial abuse while your relatives defend the abuser, you understand the isolation of fighting alone for truth that everyone else has decided is too painful to acknowledge. The evidence Patricia reviewed was damning and comprehensive. Bank records showing systematic unauthorized transfers, property documents revealing forged signatures, investment account statements proving depletion through management fees that had never been disclosed or authorized, and my grandmother's meticulous handwritten documentation of discrepancies she'd observed over years of careful record keeping. Your grandmother created an excellent paper trail, Patricia observed as she studied Rose's careful notes. These records show she understood exactly what Robert was doing and was trying to protect the family's interests by documenting his theft. But her documentation isn't enough to prosecute if my family won't admit they were victims of his theft. Financial elder abuse cases require victim cooperation to be successful. If your family members testify that they authorized Robert's management decisions, it becomes very difficult to prove criminal intent. The legal consultation revealed the sophisticated nature of Robert's theft. He'd been careful to structure his unauthorized transactions in ways that appeared to have legitimate estate management purposes, making criminal prosecution difficult without family testimony about lack of authorization. The most sophisticated family, thieves structure their crimes to look like authorized management, making their victims' cooperation essential for proving criminal intent rather than administrative discretion. But Patricia also explained that civil action might be more successful than criminal prosecution. Even if we can't prove criminal theft beyond a reasonable doubt, we might be able to recover assets through civil litigation for breach of fiduciary duty and unauthorized estate management. The prospect of suing my own family members to recover stolen inheritance felt like the final destruction of relationships I'd spent my whole life nurturing, but the alternative was allowing Robert to complete his theft with legal protection and family approval. What happens to family relationships if I pursue civil litigation? Honestly, families that choose to protect financial abusers over victims rarely survive the legal process intact. You'll likely lose most of your family relationships, regardless of whether you win in court. The drive home from Patricia's office felt like a funeral procession for the family I'd always believed we were. Tree-lined streets that had once felt like paths to holiday gatherings and birthday celebrations now felt like roads to nowhere, leading to a future where justice and family love had become mutually exclusive. That evening, I called Dad to inform him about my meeting with Patricia and my intention to pursue legal recovery of stolen inheritance. The conversation was the most painful of my life. "Diana, please don't do this to our family," Dad pleaded, his voice breaking with the grief of a man watching his daughter choose legal action over family loyalty. Roberts agreed to additional financial disclosures and more transparent management going forward. Can't that be enough? Dad, Robert has stolen over $300,000 from us. Additional disclosures and transparent management don't return the money he's already taken. But lawsuits will cost tens of thousands in legal fees and destroy every relationship in our family. Even if you win, everyone loses. Everyone's already lost, Dad. We lost our inheritance. We lost our trust. We lost the security Grandma and Grandpa worked their whole lives to provide for us. I'm trying to recover what Robert stole. Sometimes the most heartbreaking family conversations are those where you realize that choosing justice means accepting that you'll be fighting alone against everyone you've ever loved. The call ended with Dad's ultimatum: pursue legal action and lose my family forever, or accept Robert's additional oversight and preserve relationships that had already been poisoned by 15 years of systematic deception. If you file a lawsuit against Robert, you're choosing legal action over your family. I hope money is worth losing everyone who loves you. But it wasn't about money. It was about honor, justice, and ensuring that Robert couldn't complete his theft with family protection. It was about my grandmother's trust and the legacy she'd tried to preserve for her grandchildren. That night, Surrounded by evidence of Robert's systematic betrayal and family documentation of their choice to protect him rather than acknowledge his victims, I made the decision that would define the rest of my life. I signed Patricia's retainer agreement and authorized her to file civil litigation for recovery of stolen family assets. The woman who'd spent 42 years prioritizing family harmony over personal justice was about to become someone who chose truth over acceptance, even when that choice meant losing everything she'd thought mattered most. Sometimes the most important battles we fight are those we fight alone, not because we want to be isolated, but because standing up for what's right requires more courage than most people possess. The legal papers were filed on a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 3 months after I'd discovered my grandmother's hidden evidence. By Thursday, I was officially estranged from every family member except my attorney, fighting alone for justice that everyone else had decided was less important than preserving relationships with a thief. But some things are worth fighting for, even when you have to fight alone. And some truths are worth telling, even when everyone you love refuses to listen. My grandmother had trusted me to be strong enough to expose Robert's theft and fight for what was right. I wasn't going to let her down, regardless of what it cost me. 18 months after filing civil litigation against Robert, I sat in the same courthouse where my grandmother had once served jury duty, listening to a judge deliver a verdict that would finally provide justice for 15 years of systematic family theft. The morning sunlight streaming through tall courthouse windows felt like vindication as Judge Harrison read his decision in a voice that carried the authority of someone who'd seen through Robert's manipulation attempts. The evidence presented in this case demonstrates systematic breach of fiduciary duty, unauthorized asset transfers, and financial elder abuse spanning 15 years, Judge Harrison announced. The defendant will be required to return $287,000 in assets that were improperly transferred from estate accounts, plus interest and legal fees. The taste of justice was sweet, but bittersweet, because the family members who should have been celebrating this victory were instead sitting on Robert's side of the courtroom, still defending the man who'd stolen from them for over a decade. Sometimes the most complete victories feel hollow because the people you fought to protect have chosen to remain loyal to the person who victimized them, rather than acknowledging the truth you sacrificed everything to expose. Patricia squeezed my hand as the judge continued reading his detailed findings, which systematically destroyed every defense Robert had attempted during months of litigation. The court had found that Robert's management fees were unauthorized and excessive, that his property transfers violated fiduciary duties, and that his explanations for discrepancies were inconsistent with documented evidence and lacking credibility. If you've ever pursued justice against family financial abuse, you understand both the relief and sadness of winning in court while losing the relationships you were trying to protect. Legal vindication doesn't heal the emotional wounds created by family betrayal and enabling. Robert's face showed no remorse as the judgment was read, only the calculated expression of someone already planning appeals and delay tactics. Even in defeat, he maintained the entitled demeanor of someone who believed his theft had been justified by his family's trust and gratitude. The defendant's attempts to characterize unauthorized transactions as legitimate estate management were contradicted by comprehensive documentation and testimony. Judge Harrison continued. Mrs. Rose's contemporaneous records provide clear evidence that she recognized and attempted to document what she correctly identified as systematic financial abuse. My grandmother's voice had finally been heard, her careful documentation vindicated, and her trust in my ability to expose Robert's lies validated. The justice she'd been too afraid to pursue during her lifetime had been achieved through her courage in preserving evidence for someone willing to fight. But the family cost of this victory was enormous. Dad hadn't spoken to me in over a year. My aunts treated me like a traitor who destroyed family unity for personal gain, and my cousins Sarah and Michael had completely cut off contact rather than acknowledge their father's systematic theft. The cruelest irony of family financial abuse cases is that achieving justice often means losing the family you were trying to protect, because the victims cannot forgive the person who exposed their suffering more easily than they can forgive the person who caused it. Outside the courthouse, Patricia helped me understand the practical implications of our victory. Robert has 30 days to begin asset recovery payments, and if he attempts to hide or transfer assets to avoid payment, he'll face contempt of court charges that could result in jail time. Will the money actually be recovered? Or will he find ways to avoid paying? The judgment creates legal mechanisms to garnish wages, place liens on property, and freeze accounts if necessary. Robert's going to pay, whether he wants to or not. The financial recovery would restore most of what Robert had stolen, but it couldn't repair the family relationships that had been destroyed by his theft and the family's choice to protect him rather than acknowledge his victims. Driving home from the courthouse, I passed the cemetery where my grandparents were buried, and I stopped to visit their graves for the first time since filing the lawsuit. The scent of flowers and fresh grass filled the afternoon air as I stood beside Rose's headstone, finally able to tell her that her trust had been honored and justice had been achieved. I kept my promise, Grandma. Robert has to return the money he stole, and everyone knows the truth now, even if they're not ready to admit it yet. Sometimes the most meaningful conversations we have are one-sided discussions with people who are no longer alive, but whose love and trust continue to guide our decisions about justice and courage. The legal victory provided financial recovery, but not family reconciliation. In the months following the judgment, no family members contacted me to acknowledge that they'd been wrong about Robert or to express gratitude for exposing his theft. Instead, the silence continued, as if admitting I'd been right about Robert would require acknowledging they'd been wrong to defend him. But there were unexpected benefits to choosing justice over family approval. The attorney fees were covered by the judgment. The recovered assets provided financial security I'd never expected to have. And the knowledge that I'd honored my grandmother's trust gave me peace that family acceptance could never have provided. More importantly, Robert's theft had been exposed and stopped. Future family members would be protected from his financial manipulation, and the legal precedent established would make it harder for him to victimize anyone else. 2 years after the courthouse victory, I received an unexpected phone call from Sarah, Robert's daughter, whose voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd finally seen through years of manipulation. "Diana, I owe you an apology. Dad's been having financial problems since the judgment, and I discovered he's been stealing from my savings account to pay legal fees. You were right about him all along." The conversation was the beginning of a slow family reconciliation that started with Robert's children acknowledging his pattern of financial abuse, and gradually expanded to include other family members who'd witnessed additional evidence of his dishonest character. Sometimes the most profound vindications come not from legal victories, but from family members finally recognizing that the person they defended was exactly who you said they were all along. "Sarah, I never wanted to be right about your father's theft. I just wanted to stop him from stealing from us. I understand that now. And I understand why you had to pursue legal action when none of us would listen. You were protecting all of us, even when we were too blind to see it." The family relationships that gradually rebuilt over the following years were stronger than what we'd lost, because they were based on truth rather than comfortable lies, accountability rather than enabling, and respect for justice rather than loyalty to manipulation. My grandmother's legacy was ultimately preserved not just through financial recovery, but through the courage she'd given me to choose justice over acceptance, truth over harmony, and honor over approval. Standing alone had been the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it had also been the most important. Some battles are worth fighting regardless of the cost, and some truths are worth telling regardless of who refuses to listen. The woman who'd discovered hidden documents in a manila envelope had become someone strong enough to honor the trust of someone who'd believed justice was possible, even when everyone else preferred comfortable lies. If Diana's story resonated with you, you're not alone. Family financial abuse affects millions of people who trust the wrong relatives with their inheritance, savings, and financial security. Too often, these victims suffer in silence because exposing family theft means choosing justice over relationships. Key life lessons from Diana's journey: trust but verify financial management. Even family members with decades of credibility can be systematically stealing while maintaining appearances of generosity and expertise. Document everything when something feels wrong. Diana's grandmother saved evidence for years because her intuition told her Robert's explanations didn't match the financial reality she observed. Don't let family loyalty enable criminal behavior. Protecting thieves because they're relatives doesn't preserve family harmony. It ensures continued victimization of innocent people. Standing alone for justice is better than standing together for lies. Sometimes the most courageous act is refusing to participate in family denial about obvious abuse. Legal action isn't about money, it's about accountability. Pursuing justice for financial abuse protects future victims and honors the trust of people who worked their whole lives to provide security for their families. Have you experienced similar family betrayal? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might help someone else recognize manipulation they're currently experiencing. Subscribe for more real family drama stories that expose the truth about financial abuse, manipulation, and the courage required to fight for justice when everyone you love is against you. Follow us for weekly content about standing up to family manipulation, protecting your inheritance, and finding strength when you have to choose between truth and acceptance. Remember, you deserve family members who protect your interests rather than exploiting your trust. Never apologize for demanding accountability from people who are supposed to love and support you. Share this video if you believe family financial abuse deserves exposure and consequences. Every person who hears Diana's story might recognize similar warning signs in their own family situation. Your voice matters. Your truth matters. And your courage to speak up might save someone else from years of systematic theft disguised as family loyalty.